And we'll be starting in just a moment. We're just giving people a few minutes to log in. Well, welcome everyone. I am Lauren Toomer, a lecturer here in both arts and anatomy. And on behalf of my medicine and the muse colleagues, we thank you for being here today. We have incredible panelists that are joining us from close by and far away, as you will hear, who are experts in this discussion. I would also like to thank our event sponsors, the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Medical Humanities and the Arts, with much gratitude to our wonderful Dr. Bryant Lynn, who will also speak, Jackie Genovese, and Christy Hartman for really spearheading this discussion. Also, the Asian American Research Center at Stanford and the Stanford Storytelling Project. As we continue to be in unprecedented times, it is important to understand the history of how law and amendments come into being and actually what those laws mean. Our committee realized this issue of birthright citizenship was one of the many of us wanted to learn more about. So we reached out to our community and we realized that there was a desire for more information. So we have the huge privilege of being at Stanford University with incredible faculty, as you know, students and staff who strive for understanding and community, particularly in tough times. So as we begin, I invite us all to take a moment to arrive fully in the space. You know, it's a lovely Saturday morning, and I commend you all for taking the time to be here and give your attention fully to this present moment, to open yourselves up to the conversations ahead, listening and learning from our incredible speakers, insights, and lived experiences. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce the one, the only, our first speaker, Gordon Chang, a professor in the Department of History and the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities. He has written and continues to publish in the areas of U.S. diplomacy, America-China relations, the Chinese diaspora, Asian American history, and global history. So a warm welcome to Professor Gordon Chang.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and to the others who organized this event. This is a very important topic, and I hope to present some information in concise form to those who have joined us. Before I begin, I'd just like to also say Happy International Women's Day. Today is March 8th, International Women's Day. There are gender connections to birthright citizenship, but to citizenship more generally. I don't know if we'll be able to get to those, but they are interesting as well. That raises the issue of citizenship. And many of us may take for granted citizenship. That is to say, it's something we just have. But the history and the evolution of laws, policies, practices regarding U.S. citizenship have evolved and developed tremendously over the years, over the length of the history of the country. Now, today we're addressing the issue of birthright citizenship. What is birthright citizenship? It is the practice, the policy, the assumption that has been held in the United States for more than 100 years, since one can date it since the post-Civil War period. But in brief, birthright citizenship means that if you are born in the United States, or the territories controlled by the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, regardless of the status of your parents, of who birthed you, and your family circumstances. So if you were here, if your family was here, your parents were here, undocumented, permanent, maybe permanent or not permanent residents, even transitory, if whatever status they were, you were born in the United States, you automatically had U.S. citizenship. That's the fundamental issue of birthright citizenship. Now, we know from the news that there are those in Washington who are keenly interested in ending this practice of more than 150 years or so. And it has may have enormous consequences. Even the talk about it has enormous consequences and implications for millions of Americans. And this issue is of interest to me as an academic, but also as a person, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, how did birthright citizenship come to be? I'll go a little bit of historical background and talk about the evolution of citizenship, granting of citizenship in the United States. In the early republic, the attitude towards citizenship was pretty loose. Just about if you were in the United States at the time of the U.S. Revolution and you were white, free white, you were considered to be a U.S. citizen. But in 1790, the Congress passed the first act, which calls the Nationality or Naturalization Act of 1790, which recognized that any free white person, those were the operative words, could become a citizen of the United States. That is what we would call today naturalized citizens of the United States. If they were born in France and came to the U.S., a free white person, male or female, could become a citizen of the United States. But is clearly racial imprinted. Now, that meant Native peoples, African Americans, slaves, non-slaves, were not in that category, or Asians or others. Now, the Civil War was a turning point in citizenship, particularly because of the attention to slaves and who became the freed people. And different acts and constitutional amendments extended and verified citizenship for the formerly enslaved people. So it was a very big issue. One of the most important parts of this was the 14th Amendment, in which there is the phrase that any person born in the United States is a United States citizen. So that's a very important phrase. There are other phrases that recognize explicitly the formerly enslaved people having citizenship. So that was the 14th Amendment. A few years later, in 1870, there was the Naturalization Act of 1870, which expanded on the earlier language of free white persons becoming eligible for citizenship and included the phrase persons of African nativity. And that was to make sure that any formerly enslaved people who had been born in Africa and not been born in the United States, which was covered by the 14th Amendment, could become naturalized citizens. But still, the two racial categories were white. We call them racial categories, white and persons of African nativity. Now, 1882 is another. I don't go into too many details further, but to get us up to the key issue at hand is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which many of you have heard about. And a very important provision of that act, and this was Congress's intent, was to make sure that Chinese couldn't slip somehow into the category becoming eligible for naturalized citizenship. Because in the 1882 Act, there is the clause that Chinese were aliens ineligible to citizenship, period. Now, we think that may be clear in its intent and its meaning, but that was not the case. So now we move to a landmark case, which we now know as Wong Kim Ark, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was a Chinese. His parents had come into the country before the Chinese Exclusion Act. They did not become U.S. citizens because of the act. He had been born, though, in the United States, in San Francisco. And he traveled back to China a couple of times in the 1890s, had returned to the country after his first visit without problem. He had the proper papers. He was shown he was born in the United States, and there was assumption that he was a U.S. citizen. The second time he came back, the immigration officials stopped him and said, "You can't come into the United States. We're excluding you." And he said, "Why? I came," and so forth. Well, I was here before. I was born in the United States. And the argument was that the Chinese Exclusion Act extended to him through blood, what they call blood. That since his parents were Chinese and people ineligible to citizenship, he as their offspring also was ineligible to citizenship. So that was the ambiguity at that time, they thought, between persons born in the United States and some of these other statutes. Well, the case, Wong Kim Ark was a fighter. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And eventually, the Supreme Court upheld Wong Kim Ark's argument. And that was a landmark case in confirming the language and the meaning of the 14th Amendment clause, saying that all persons born in the United States were citizens of the United States. And that has been acted upon pretty consistently all the way since the late 19th century. Now, I'll just end here with a personal reflection. My own grandfather came into this country illegally, I think. It's hard to prove illegality, but I think he came in illegally through Canada in the early 1880s, before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And because he never had any papers, he didn't have any citizenship papers, immigration papers, visa pay, anything like that. And once he was here, he never left, because I think he knew he could never come back if he was to leave. So he was one of these aliens ineligible to citizenship, and he was here without documents. He and his wife, my grandmother, had 11 children, all born out near Lake Tahoe, Truckee, and Marysville. And very proud and great family, and I'm very, very happy to have been part of them. Now, none of them ever had any problems with travel or with their citizenship or voting or anything of that sort. They were all American citizens who clearly confirmed they were American citizens with their birth certificates in the United States. So when I think back on it, I'm proud of being the offspring of, if you will, an illegal immigrant. And I have sympathy with those who have come in various ways over the years. And so-called undocumented immigrants have been a huge part of our country. And their history is the personal history, family history of millions of Americans. And this is all to say that the attack on birthright citizenship I see it as a direct attack on many, many Americans and our basic rights that we've had over decades, and has implication politically, personally, and morally for the country, I think, of how we understand what it is to be an American. So I'll stop there, and I understand we have other great speakers today and some time at the end for discussion. So I hope we can have that time to exchange opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chang, for your insightful and also the personal connection to it. It's always lovely to see it in this well-rounded way in terms of history and your own narrative. I'm another lovely speaker that we have for today is Hank Greely, who is the Deane F. and Kate Edelman Johnson Professor of Law and Professor. And by courtesy of genetics at Stanford University, he specializes in ethical, legal, and social issues arising from advances in the biosciences, particularly from genetics, neuroscience, and the human stem cell research. I also want to especially thank Hank because he is coming in all the way from Zoom from Spain. So we really, really appreciate you spending the time to share your expertise with us.
Hola, buenas tardes, o para mí, buenas noches. Es 11 en la noche aquí. So I'm currently teaching at Stanford in Madrid, the undergraduate program. I will be here for another week and a half until the winter quarter ends. And it is 11:16 p.m. here. I've had a very nice dinner with significant wine, so I hope I can make sense. As you may have heard, if you may have noticed from Lauren, I work on law and the biosciences, which doesn't have that much to do with birthright citizenship. I am not a specialist. I have not written on the issue of birthright citizenship, nor am I particularly a constitutional law specialist, although I have taught and continue to teach issues around constitutional law. But I thought I could maybe give some useful background to this issue. First, what is birthright citizenship? it is a long-standing approach to deciding who is a citizen of a country. Now, I say long-standing, but nation states actually aren't all that long-standing. You don't have to go back very many hundreds of years till you get before a concept of nation states. But if you look at the early colonial period and the early period of the American Republic and at the English precedents beforehand, unlike some European countries, they took the position that anybody born in the country was a citizen of the country. Now, that was the underlying English common law, as discussed by William Blackstone, whose treatise, an Englishman whose treatises on the English common law were extraordinarily influential in early American legal thinking. And it was generally the position taken by American states, except many of the states that did not extend birthright citizenship to people of African ancestry, particularly, but not always, people who were slaves. Now, in the South, African Americans, and particularly slaves who were born in the United States, were not viewed as citizens. In the North, it varied. In some states, they were viewed as citizens. In some states, they weren't. But things took a strange turn in 1857 with what is generally conceded to be the worst Supreme Court decision in history. Although I'm reminded of the Simpsons joke where Bart says to Homer, "This is the worst day of my life." And Homer says, "So far." So this is the worst US Supreme Court decision so far. Dred Scott. The Dred Scott decision was fascinating, and there's a wonderful book by the late Donald Fehrenbacher, a Stanford history professor, focused on the Dred Scott decision. It was an effort by the Supreme Court with some connivance with or some understandings with the incoming new president, James Buchanan, to try to resolve issues that were leading the country toward the Civil War. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Taney, was from Maryland, a slave state at that point. He managed to get a majority of the court to agree to several positions in a case that was brought in federal court by a man who had been a slave in Missouri, but his owner took him to Illinois. And Illinois was a free state. Illinois and Minnesota, the territory of Minnesota at the time he was there, free jurisdictions. There's English precedent going back to the 1770s in a famous case called Somerset that says, if you are a slave and you come into a free jurisdiction, you come into England, which has no slavery, you are no longer a slave. And that was generally perceived as the underlying common law. And so his position, which he fought over 10 years in a variety of courts, was that once he came to Illinois, he was free. And when he was moved back to Missouri and they said, you're a slave again, that was wrong because he had become free and couldn't become unfree. The US Supreme Court ultimately disagreed. They decided that he was not a citizen of the United States, and hence the US courts had no jurisdiction over him. Jurisdiction is one of those issues that lawyers love and non-lawyers hate. And it's a really complicated question about when a court has power. But the way that he had sued required him to be the citizen of a different state than the person he was suing, what we call in federal jurisdiction, diversity citizenship. And they said, no, you're not a citizen at all, and so you can't sue under diversity citizenship. Under today's kind of understanding, that would have ended the case. Once there is no jurisdiction, the case is over, etc., and nothing more can be said. But times were different then, and Justice Taney really wanted to try to end the unpleasantness that was going on between the slaveholders and the abolitionists. And so the court continued to say, not only wasn't Scott a citizen, but that no person of African origin could ever become a citizen of the United States, because when the Constitution was created and they said, "we the people," they didn't mean blacks. They meant everybody, well, they meant many people, but not blacks. And so blacks were completely barred from ever being considered citizens. They also decided that the Missouri Compromise of 1850, which had held the Union together for another decade or so by saying Missouri's admitted as a free state, but you can't have slaves north of a particular line, that was unconstitutional, because that deprived slaveholders of their rights to take slaves into territories in the West that were north of that line. Their hope was this would put the questions to rest because, hey, the Supreme Court has spoken and blacks aren't citizens and don't worry about it, go away. It was so it is viewed as one of the worst decisions ever by the US Supreme Court. First, because in a whole bunch of ways, it made no sense. Once you've decided there's no jurisdiction, you can't say anything else. But even apart from that, there was plenty of precedent from the northern states where free blacks or black people born in Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey were viewed as citizens, were viewed as voting citizens. There's a lot of precedent that they were citizens that the court completely ignored, as well as completely ignoring the English precedents that said anybody born in England is an English, well, citizen or subject, but has rights. The other way it's the worst decision ever by the US Supreme Court is their hope was they would make the issue go away, but in fact, they just poured gasoline onto the flames. And so it exacerbated the tensions between the North and the South. And when 4 years later, Abraham Lincoln became president, even before he was inaugurated, the southern states began to secede. And we had the worst war in American history, where something like 10% of the military age males in both the North and the South were killed during the Civil War. Was there anything good that came out of the Civil War? Well, yeah, there were some things, including the end of slavery. But three things in particular came out of the Civil War, three amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution was passed in 1789 and fully ratified in 1791. It is a hard thing to amend. It takes a vote of 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. And then the really hard part is if you can imagine 3/4 of the House or the Senate right now voting to say 2 + 2 = 4, it then needs the ratification by 3/4 of the states. And it's very hard to imagine 3/4 of the states ratifying agreeing on anything today. But in the aftermath of the Civil War, and using some strong arm tactics involving the southern states that had seceded, three amendments got passed. The three Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The 13th Amendment said slavery is unconstitutional, period. It is one of only two, I think, provisions of the Constitution that applies to everybody. Most of the provisions of the Constitution apply to governments. The state can't do this. The federal government can't do that. The 13th Amendment says no one can be held to involuntary servitude by anybody else. That was passed in 1865 and ratified in 1866. The next one was the 14th Amendment, passed in 1866, eventually ratified by 3/4 of the states in 1868. It is a complicated and long amendment. Some of it actually made the news fairly recently because there's a provision that says anybody who engaged in an act of insurrection against the government of the United States cannot run for an office of trust or honor under the United States. And there were people who tried to have that applied ineffectively, ultimately, to Donald Trump. But the crucial part of it for our purposes is Section 1. And Section 1 had many important things. It said that anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and the state in which they reside. That's birthright citizenship. And that was the people of the United States acting through Congress and the state legislatures basically overruling Dred Scott. Dred Scott said Black people can never be citizens. The 14th Amendment, Section 1 said, no, anybody born in the US is a citizen of the United States. Now, there were other provisions. There was one applying to all citizens the privileges and immunities of citizenship. That could have been a big deal, but the US Supreme Court kind of eviscerated that pretty quickly. There was another one that said no state may deny any person the equal protection of the laws. That also got eviscerated fairly quickly, but then revived later. And that was the main constitutional provision that fired and fueled the civil rights litigation of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now. And then there was another one saying, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which is another really important provision, which for a while guaranteed women the right to an abortion, continues to guarantee, for now, people the right to use contraception, people the right to have same-sex marriage, people a number of rights, at least for today. The 15th Amendment, which was, I believe, passed in 68 and ratified in 1870, said race cannot be used to keep people from having the right to vote. You can't deny the right to vote to somebody based on their race. Footnote, it didn't say anything about sex. You could continue to deny people the right to vote based on their sex for another 49 years. But Black people were constitutionally allowed to vote based on the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870. What's that all have to do with today? We now have people saying the birthright citizenship provision of the 14th Amendment isn't as broad as it sounds. And what they usually point to is a language in the amendment that says people born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction. That almost certainly says if you are the child of an ambassador or a consular agent who is born in the United States, ambassadors, consular agents, they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. The Embassy of France is this little enclave of French territory in the middle of DC, and they're not subject to American jurisdiction. And that's the way it's been read consistently. And as Gordon quite nicely laid out, that's the way that a really racist and anti-Chinese judiciary in the 19th century read that law to say that a man of Chinese origin born in the United States was an American citizen. I teach an introduction to American law course for the roughly 80 or 90 foreign law students we have every year at the law school doing graduate degrees. And one of the things that amazes them most is the power we vest in our Supreme Court, the way that people become judges, because in most countries, being a judge is a civil service job. You train to be a judge, you start out as a low judge. If you get good, you get promoted to a better judge and a better judge. In the US, the best way to become a federal judge is to have been the law school roommate of somebody who becomes a senator. That's not quite true, but it's not quite false either. At the federal level, most judges have good political connections. They are at least decent lawyers or viewed as decent lawyers, but their career has not been judging. A result of that is we have a judiciary that has more of a sense of independence and less of a sense of being tied to particular interpretive rules. For most of my lifetime, most judges have interpreted the Constitution to try to make it make sense in the current day. An adaptive constitution, an evolved constitution, a living constitution, there are a number of different terms for it. But it's to say, well, yeah, in 1791 with the Second Amendment, they might have thought the right to bear arms meant this. But now when the arms can be intercontinental ballistic missiles or bazookas, it's not exactly the swords and the blunderbusses and the muskets that existed in 1789. In recent years, the last couple of decades, there's been the rise of a more originalist jurisprudence. Lawyers love to subdivide things, so there are tens of different versions of originalism. But the two most important, I think, one says we look at what the people who passed the law intended at the time. And that's what the law means. So for the 14th Amendment, it would be what did the people in Congress, in the House, in the Senate, and in the 3/4 of the state legislatures that ratified the amendment, what did they think the amendment meant? A slightly different version is a textualist version that says, what did those words mean at the time? We'll look at the words. We don't care about the intent. We'll look at the words. And as arcane as this may be, this turns out to be an important living distinction. Justice Gorsuch, generally a very devout conservative, said that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act protected same gay and lesbian people from discrimination because the wording talked about discrimination based on sex. And the dissenters, most of the other conservatives, said, wait, in 1964, when the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they had no idea that they were saying that gay people, if they even knew what gay people were entitled to protection from discrimination. So you've got those two different approaches. What I think is so interesting in this context, both of those approaches should lead, all of those approaches should lead to the same result. The argument against birthright citizenship is really hard to make. If you believe in an adaptive constitution and a constitution that grows as a result of tradition and change over time, then, for the last 160 years, 155 years, we've understood birthright citizenship means everybody born in the US, period, especially since the Supreme Court decision that Gordon talked about. And that makes sense in our current world. If you believe in what they intended at the time, you probably look at what was England doing, what were northern states doing, and that was birthright citizenship, anybody born. And there was none of this idea that subject to the jurisdiction had anything to do with whether your immigrants were legal or illegal. Until the Chinese Exclusion Act, actually, it was really hard to be an illegal immigrant because there weren't very many laws, if any, about who could or couldn't immigrate to the United States. So what they thought in 1868 almost certainly seems to be everybody born counts. And then if you look at the language says anybody born in the United States is in the United, except those who are not subject to its jurisdiction, which seems to and is really not something that says anything about whether you're legal or illegal. Whether you are a legal immigrant or an illegal immigrant, you're subject to the jurisdiction. You can be arrested, you can be detained, you have to pay taxes, all of that stuff. So, any audience's two favorite words from any speaker, in conclusion, there is a lot of effort to restrict birthright citizenship. There is, I think, no good, plausible legal argument to restrict birthright citizenship. But one of the main strands of 20th and increasingly 21st century legal thought is legal realism. The one sentence definition of legal realism is the law is what the judges say the law is. If 5 justices of the Supreme Court say this is, birthright citizenship doesn't really exist the way we thought it does, it doesn't exist. I don't think that's going to happen. I think 1 or 2 justices might buy that. Justice Alito, who seems to be willing to buy anything that the right wing says, might do that. Justice Thomas, who is a little more principled, might not. I think birthright citizenship is probably safe. But no, my ability to assess American politics and American judicial decisions has been proven over the last 8 or 9 years to be deeply flawed. So that's my best guess, but time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Greely, for grounding us in this deeper understanding of the law and how it impacts our past, certainly, and how it affects our future as well in our present day. As we start to transition into hearing stories from our other speakers, I wanted to quote author and journalist Richard Wagamese, who says, "We are all story. That's why my people say, from moments we enter this physical reality to the moment we depart again. As spirit, we are energy, moving forward to the fullest possible expression of ourselves. All the intrepid spirits who come to this reality make the same journey. In this, we are joined, we are one. We are, in the end, one story, one song, one spirit." In the spirit of this statement, I'm happy to introduce Chali Lee, who is a queer Hmong American from Fresno, California. He comes from a lineage of Hmong refugee soldiers who wrestled in America, followed the secret war in the late 1980s. He's the first generation in his family to be born in the US and the second generation to call the US home. He is a Stanford alum, fellow alum like myself, earning a BA in the class of 2024, and currently he serves as the program associate at the Asian American Research Center at Stanford. We look forward to hearing your story, Charlie.
Hey, thank you, Lauren. So my family's history and journey to the United States happened less than 50 years ago. Happening the same time as the Vietnam American War, the Hmong living in Laos were recruited by the US CIA to serve in their special guerrillas unit to stop the spread of communism. The Hmong agreed to help the US in exchange for guns, supplies, food, and protection. And this deal was struck by Hmong leader General Vang Pao and the US CIA. It was signed by a handshake, marking the beginning of the secret war in 1962. The Hmong soldiers, including my grandfathers, helped the Americans navigate the terrain, carried out sabotaging missions, and fought in the battlefields alongside US troops. And after the war seemed lost, the US fled and left the Hmong to die. They broke their promise of protecting the Hmong, even though the Hmong kept their promise in helping and protecting American soldiers on Lao soil. The Pathet Lao communist group deemed the Hmong as traitors for helping Americans, and so they ordered the Hmong to be killed and thrown in re-education camps, starting the Hmong genocide. My grandparents held on to their children and ran further south, leading them to the Mekong River where they crossed without knowing how to swim. Unfortunately, we were one of the families that made it to Thailand and were thrown in the refugee camps. As I would later learn, they couldn't justify bringing Hmong people to the States earlier because this secret war never happened, and my people who helped the US CIA never existed to America. The secret war was secret even to America. And so after a few years, the Americans would come back and begin airlifting the Hmong to the States as refugees. And both my mom and dad's families came to the US in the late 1980s, meaning that we have only been here for less than 40 years. My siblings and I were the first of my family to be born in America. And growing up, they didn't really talk about their status to us kids. But in school, it was obvious what the sentiment from others was. And so for context, I went to a predominantly white K through 12 school, and some of my earliest memories were of my white peers making fun of me and my grandpa. And so my grandpa would pick me up from school every day, but we didn't really have cars, and so he would walk to pick me up. My grandpa also didn't speak English. And so the white kids would look at me and ask if my family was illegal and immigrants. And all I knew how to say was that we were refugees. They said that they know my family is illegal because my grandpa doesn't know English, and that I don't belong in the school because I'm an immigrant, and my family doesn't have cars or money. My parents don't show up to parent-student conferences, and essentially that we don't follow rules. And although I say that they made fun of me, years and years of this would make it obvious that it was violence committed towards me, my family, and my community from white supremacy. The notion that we don't belong and that we don't deserve a place in America. The notion that my family and I are freeloaders who don't contribute, but only take. But I thought to myself, my people fought in the war for America. And these days, I think a lot about my identity as a Hmong American. Being of the first generation born in America, I sit at this bridge with so many other amazing people, honoring my Hmong traditional customs and standing in collective power and solidarity with each other's struggles. And I think about how this land in California are my home, how the earth witnessed my birth and my soul witnessed and played on its soil. And I think about my parents and grandparents becoming refugees in their own war-torn countries and understanding that even then, and even as a stateless people, we have always yearned for a place to call home. I think about how American politics have never been able to truly understand Hmong people and recognize us for our contributions. But I also recognize how much of my family's being in America is not from them, but from the vast supportive communities and leaders that sponsored my family here and helped them assimilate to America. The organizations that gave my family new clothes and warm food during tough times, my friendly immigrant and refugee neighbors who watched out for one another and made sure that my grandpa and I got home safe after school every day. The communities and organizations that advocate fiercely for the rights of immigrants and refugees, the people in this Zoom listening to my story. It comes down to that we have always learned and leaned from one another, and we have supported each other despite political attacks. And I urge us to keep staying connected and to keep on showing up with radical care for yourself, your communities, and the communities that need it most now. I am a Hmong American, and I have a right to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chali, for your vulnerability and sharing your story with us. It's important to see the face and the stories behind what's often just put in words. So thank you, Chali. Which brings me to our next speaker, who I also have the pleasure of introducing, is Bolu Watife Aminu, a sophomore at Stanford University studying computer science and minoring in African American studies. Having immigrated from Nigeria to the US at the age of 5 and growing up in Delaware, Bolu enjoys writing stories that explore the intersection of race, gender, and family expectations. Thank you, Bolu.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Hi, everyone. I'm Bolu, and my piece is titled Where We Landed, Where We Stayed. My youth in Nigeria was full of wishes, and there's no better place for saying my innermost desires than the playground. During my break time in my Nigerian elementary school, as my mates were playing on the playground, I couldn't help but wish to leave. The juxtaposition between my classmates' jovial laughter and my grumbling belly made me feel like an outsider. Because back then, my family and I were living off of ramen noodle packets, or as we called them in Nigeria, Indomie. And then we would bounce from family member to family member as my single mother struggled to provide for us. Even from a young age, at 5, I knew that this was not sustainable. So I prayed to God, my mom filed our case, we all did our parts, and I'm here, surrounded by bountiful opportunities. And as young as I was then, I knew the hardships that we'd experienced in Nigeria would not persist. And though I was saddened that we had left extended family behind, those who supported us, this didn't mean that we were completely alone in the States. When we first arrived, my mom's younger sister, Mariah, who had arrived shortly ahead of us after winning a visa lottery from Nigeria, had moved into an apartment in northern Delaware. There we stayed, and within the first week, my sister and I excitedly played around in our first ever American home. From the days where I couldn't play due to hunger in Nigeria, to not being able to bounce from wall to wall on a full belly, I just knew America would be different. But we knew our time was up in the apartments after our jumping and singing caused the neighbors to call the cops on us. And so, once again, we moved, but this time to a 3-bedroom townhome just a bit south of Delaware. And this neighborhood far surpassed the ones in Nigeria, with everything from the mosquito nets in Nigeria being replaced to the air conditioning in Delaware, to the yards that were replaced by public pools. America truly was different. And I was also excited about the thought of getting my own room. But his excitement quickly dissipated when I learned that 3 other family members would be joining us from Nigeria. Though I was hesitant at first, when I was introduced to them, I grew to love them. They were my mom's older brother, Uncle Aki, my distant aunt, Auntie Busola, and my other uncle, though I don't really think he's my uncle, I simply call him that because I can't call him by his first name, and he was also called Uncle Aki. And yes, my mom has many siblings. She's tied of 5. So though the typical American family had 2 parents and 2 kids, as I would see with my many classmates, I realized from an early age that that was not the case for my family situation, but that didn't make it any less different or special. And on Mondays, Uncle Aki, my mom's brother, who was also pursuing nursing school, would purchase these little rubber band bracelets my sister and I made. And while everyone else in the family brushed us off because they thought we were just playing around, he paid our obscene prices of $1 and even printed out business cards to support us. It's a shame the business didn't make it past its year-long run in 2014, but I'm always grateful to support. On Tuesdays, the other Uncle Aki, also in nursing school, took us to the movies because they were discounted on Tuesdays. And if it weren't for him, I probably would never understand the Frozen references that are still being made to this day. Then on Saturdays, Auntie Busola, also in nursing school, would make us the best pancakes, and I'm still trying to master her recipe. And yes, everyone was in nursing school, so with me studying CS, I am a bit of a black sheep, but it didn't mean that I'm not supported by them. And from a young age, as our family members took care of my sister and me, my mom could focus on her exams and many night shifts as, surprisingly, she too was in nursing school. And it didn't matter that I felt like an other in my classrooms filled with majority white classmates. As long as I could come home to my family, I felt like me, and I felt at home. And though we were all trying to settle down, we still made sure to uplift one another. We lived together for 3 years, because eventually the time came for my aunts and uncles to move out of the house and plant their own roots. But that did not mean that I got my own room. Later, my mom's elder sister, the last sibling, moved to the US with her 2 sons, daughter, and husband. All 5 of them came to live with us, and each of them had their own character. And before I knew it, all 5 of them left just 5 years later. So after 10 years of living in the States, at 15 years old, I finally got my own room, and the house had never felt quieter or emptier. With everyone moving to either Texas or Southern Delaware, it was just me, my mom, and my sister. But that didn't mean that I didn't long for the days our Fuller house would go to church together, or the Chinese buffets we'd frequent whenever there was an accomplishment in the family, because no other restaurant could contain all 10 of us. So with everyone moving out, I thought my home would be broken. But with how they all come together for my high school graduation or for my cousin's wedding coming up, I know our family is only getting stronger. And while I'm grateful to have had this opportunity to define what home means for me, I should have known that all along, it's always been with my family. And now that we're all citizens, it means my home is stable and here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bolu. I'm continually impressed with how incredible our student body is. And the story that you shared, I know touched many people's hearts, and there's so many ways that we relate to it. So thank you for sharing with us today. The next speaker I have the privilege of introducing is one of my favorite people. I want to say at Stanford, but then I can't say that. I want to say at America, but I can't say that either. I want to say the world, and I'm like, well, whoa, what about like Mars and other spaces? So let's just say the galaxy is our one and only Dr. Bryant Lin, who is a primary care physician, educator, and researcher. The cornerstone of Dr. Lin's work is keeping medicine focused on humans, patients, providers, families, and trainees, and not lost in technology and algorithms. He is the director of the Medicine and the Muse and the Humanities and the Arts program and co-director of the Center for Asian Health Research and Education. Thank you, Bryant, for being here.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren, for that kind introduction. Thanks, Gordon, Hank, Bolu, and Chali for your fantastic sharing your stories and fantastic expertise with us. I will keep it brief. One thing I forgot to mention is the reason we chose actually March 8th is that 127 years ago, The Wong Kim Ark case was argued on March 6th and March 8th. It was decided on March 28th. We chose not to have this event on March 28th because I think it's spring break. So it was either March 6th or March 8th. And so really thank all of you for joining us on a wonderful Saturday afternoon. I will keep it very brief. I'm an ABC, American-born Chinese. Am the beneficiary of birthright citizenship. My parents immigrated in 1962. My father immigrated from Taiwan in 1962, my mother in 1967. And I think um, my sister was definitely born before they were citizens, and maybe my brother as well. But I think they had gotten their citizenship by the time I was born. But I wanted to share just a story about my father. So he came in 1962, and as Gordon Hank mentioned, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which was repealed in the 40s, but the overall Chinese immigration was still fairly restricted and low until 1965. So my father came in 1962. There were not a lot of Chinese immigrants at that time. There was I always thought, apocryphal story in my family that my dad always told. He was invited as a student in the DC area. He was at University of Maryland at the time to go to the White House with the other foreign students at the time. And he said he had the invitation somewhere. We could never find it. We had a burglary in our home a few years ago and we still could not find it. But aha, the internet. The JFK archives are online, and I was able to find um, the invitation for this event. So this is in 1962. This is a picture of my dad from maybe the 50s, actually. My dad's super handsome, from the kind of James Deane era, got the James Deane hair going on and the leather jacket. And yeah, this is not obviously not his invitation, but this is the invitation that the students received in May 1962. The president and Mrs. Kennedy gave a reception on the South Lawn for the graduating classes of foreign students attending universities and colleges in the metropolitan area. So wonderful thing. I wish we had the original invitation, but I did find his name listed on the list of invitees. So again, this is a shout out to, historians like Professor Chang, and what fun it is to get some personal history there. In the circle here, of course, Taiwan, China. Most people from China were really from Hong Kong or Taiwan at the time. And this is my dad, Lin Chao-min. This is his address in Maryland. I could even find the house on Google Maps, and it's the same house. It looks the same as when he lived in it, his apartment. And you can see here on the right, they tallied up the numbers of students invited from different countries. And you can see, now there are hundreds of thousands, if not maybe, I should probably, I don't know if it crosses a million, but, at least hundreds of thousands of students from China. And, that year, there were 36 invited from the DC area. So a very different era in terms of foreign students visiting and studying in the United States. And you can also look down to India. There were 93 students from India. So, not a lot of Chinese students and Asian students and foreign students at that time. So I always thought that was really neat. But when I heard about these executive actions, executive orders going on, it really upset me that, we have so many, our country's benefited so much from immigrants. And now there's an effort to try to restrict birthright citizenship illegally, illawfully, unconstitutionally, and really out of historic bounds. So really thank you for joining us. I think we have a few minutes now, 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to hand it back to Lauren to manage the questions. So please put it in the chat or the Q&A.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, if there are any questions that you have, please place them into the chat and send them our way, and we'll give you some time to write them out. And again, I just want to thank the panelists and the speakers again as people are possibly gathering their questions for you all.
While we wait for a question, I do have a question maybe for Hank and Gordon. What do you think will happen if the Supreme Court agrees, with this assertion? What is the best way forward?
Hank, you want
Well,
you speak to the courts.
the best way forward is for the Supreme Court not to agree with this argument, which would be best, I think, both from a policy perspective and the best reading of the law, regardless of what interpretive approach one takes to the law. I would be disappointed and deeply surprised if the court did buy the anti-birthright citizenship argument, but I can no longer, in good conscience, dismiss any possibility. If it did, there are a couple of possibilities. One would be for Congress to pass a statute. Now, the relationship of statutes to constitutional amendments is complicated, but the 14th Amendment guarantees everybody birthright citizenship. You could also do that by a statute, just as statutes set out the provisions for naturalization. And so just like a statute says you can become a naturalized citizen following X, Y, and Z, a statute could say you can become that being born in the US makes you a citizen, period. I think that's right. Would such a statute pass? An awful lot of people currently voting in the US are birthright citizens, and that's a pretty big voting bloc. The Trump executive order, it's not entirely clear what an executive order can do here other than tell his minions, tell his employees to pursue or not pursue certain things. That was to take effect for people born 30 days after the order. So everybody born before February 19th of 2025 in the US would not be affected by the executive order, presumably would not be affected by a Supreme Court decision. That's a lot of voters. It's a lot of people. I hope we never have to answer this question, because I hope the courts will be brave and honest and do the right thing. But if they don't, I think then, we have to hope that Congress is brave and honest and does the right thing.
Is there anything that we can do as, citizens of America? Like, what can we do in terms of our part? What are items that we can take away? And this is open to anyone.
Can I just jump in and
Oh, sure.
I got to speak to Hank's good observations about the courts and the law. Regardless of what the courts decide, I fear this birthright challenge is part of a general anti-immigrant and anti-foreign sentiment that's rising in the United States. And I fear that this from the White House, this attack on birthright citizenship, it'll just encourage more of the same popular anti-immigrant, anti-foreign sentiment throughout the country. And anybody who doesn't look like they're supposed to be here will be a suspect, and that usually correlates with physical appearance and skin color and this. So I think that I'm hopeful, along with Hank, that something positive will transpire, but I'm also very, very worried about the general trend. I just was to say another anecdote, personally. Some years ago, I went to Mexico, which is across the border in Nogales, and I was with my wife, who's Euro American, and when we came back to the United States, across the border, she went through the turnstile. The immigration officer just kind of waved her through. I was right behind her, and I thought I would just walk right through. I mean, that's what usually was done at those years to go to Mexico. And then I was about to go through the turnstile, and he goes, "Stop. Where's your passport?" I said, "No, I was watching, all these other people are going through the turnstile. Everybody look Anglo-American. I don't care about them. I'm worried about you. Produce your document." And he kept me there and threatened to say, I can't come in until I produce my passport. So there's a lot of discretion at the border, but also throughout society about how people are treated the way they supposedly look.
Most
I mean,
definitely.
Gordon, I share your concern about rising anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's not just in the United States. It seems to be common throughout much of the developed world, both European and, East Asian. It's not like Japan and Korea are very pro-immigration. Quite the contrary. And yet, I think, what is it? Something like 15%, 12% of Americans, current Americans, were born overseas. They know a lot of people, they have a lot of friends, they have a lot of in-laws, they have a lot of grandchildren, they have a lot of connections. I think in places like North Dakota or Eastern Tennessee, immigrants may not be that visible, but in most of the country, I think they're sufficient, they're a big enough mass with enough connections that my hope is the politics that the current anti-immigrant political sentiment is a political sentiment that will be shared by the old, the isolated, and the dying out. We'll see.
Thank you both. We have one question from one of our attendees that asks, for those born after the February 2025 date per executive order, does that mean, for example, Stanford and other hospitals or counties already have the processes in place to verify mother's or father's status, or the passport offices to execute the order?
No, nobody has any mechanics set up to implement this, and that's part of the argument that this administration doesn't care about results. It cares about headlines. It cares about memes. It cares about publicity. How do you determine whether somebody was born to somebody who was here legally or not? There's no easy way. There's no currently obvious way to figure that out. And they don't seem to be very interested in setting up such a way. So incompetence may be a benefit here, may be useful.
Well, thank you. And thank you again to all of our speakers today for being part of this conversation and understanding the history and the impacts on birthright citizenship. It's not just an intellectual exercise, but it's a step toward building a more informed, compassionate, at least I hope compassionate, and just society. I hope we all continue to ask these questions, seek understanding, and engage with one another in meaningful ways like this. Leaving here with new knowledge and hopefully a renewed commitment to listening and learning and engaging with our world with care. Hopefully we'll have other future opportunities to be together. One event that we definitely want to bring to your attention is our Medical Humanities and Arts and our Arts Research Symposium at the Stanford Medicine Orchestra, which is taking place April 11th of this year at 6:30 p.m. at the Bean Concert Hall. For the students too, just so that you know, the tickets are free for them at the door with ID, and tickets for purchase will also be available soon. Yes.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Really have a
Thank
great
you.
weekend.